So today's tour, which was filmed this morning, is about D-Day, Britain during wartime, and the extraordinary top secret role that this tiny village played in making D-Day a success. So we're at a place called Kirkham Abbey, Kirkham Priory, otherwise known as the tiny village of Kirkham in North Yorkshire. I'll show you in a moment on a map where we are, but it is an absolutely delightful spot. And it's pretty much about the last place you'd imagine would have played a key role in preparing for the largest amphibious landing and invasion of the 20th century. But here we are, so you can see York in the middle on the map there, and you can see the red dot there, which is pointing at our location for today's tour. It's about 15 miles, I would say, to the northeast of York. So, as somebody mentioned, Whitby, so on the way to the coast. So we're going to start at the Church of St Mary in Westow, which is the next village. And we're going to walk through the beautiful countryside on our way to the village of Kirkham, famed for its monastic ruins. But now Kirkham has another claim to fame. A remarkable and until recently largely unknown story of how its exploits led to visits by Winston Churchill and Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth II. So Westow, located about 15 miles northeast, as I say, of York. And there comes a time in planning where there's nothing else is left to do but pray. And that was certainly the case on the eve before D-Day. Everything that could have been planned and arranged had been done. Now the fear was over factors that they couldn't control. The weather and of course the readiness of their enemy. For this they looked to God. And we have actually the words of the address that Deputy Chaplain General Canon Llewellyn Hughes gave to soldiers before D-Day 80 years ago on June 1944. We believe in a God who wants and means to have done all that Christ embodied, taught and lived out. Let an army and a people learn what God stands for, and then they will know when they are for or against his purpose, and support or oppose with confidence his commissioned servants. So the prayer and belief in divine intervention was not a sign of desperation, but rather a sense that this was a just war, that God was on their side. And of course, it hadn't seemed that way at first. There's a picture, by the way, you're looking at now of Dunkirk, we'll come to in a second. So when the German army occupied Poland on the 1st September 1939, a train of events were put in place that led to Britain declaring war on Germany to fulfil its treaty obligations. The British Expeditionary Force was largely professional soldiers and territorial units. After the kind of phony war, the Battle for France starts in May 1940, but it doesn't go to plan. The German armoured divisions push through France at lightning blitzkrieg speed, and after 6 weeks the British forces were in desperate need of a miracle. They'd been pushed back and trapped at the French port of Dunkirk. It was a dire situation, and the Royal Navy began to organise Operation Dynamo, but Churchill and his advisers thought maybe he could get 20 to 30,000 men out of the near 400,000 that were stranded. So a nation held its breath as they waited for the outcome, and a national day of prayer was called on the 26th of May 1940, not by a church but by the King and Parliament. The nation did respond. Churches across the land were packed, many gathering outside the buildings when there was no more room inside, and they committed themselves to God, admitting his desperate need for intervention. And in the following weeks, it seems that God's answer to their prayers could be clearly seen in the events that are now referred to as the miracle of Dunkirk. Nearly 900 Navy and private vessels sailed across the unusually and perhaps miraculously calm English Channel. Easterly winds blew smoke over the beaches where the soldiers waited to be evacuated, and while cloud cover prevented the Luftwaffe from bombing the Allied forces, above the cloud the Royal Air Force were able to engage. So instead of the hoped for 20 to 30,000 men, some 338,226 British and Allied troops were rescued from the beaches. They were having to abandon much of their equipment, vehicles and heavy weapons. So when looked at in this context of the prayers of a nation, it's easy to see why so many believed it was the divine intervention from God whom a king had urged his subjects to appeal to. So unusually, this church, you probably noticed, is not in the centre of the village. It's about a 10-minute walk through the fields. And these are the fields of the land girls. So as the storm clouds clouds of war had gathered across Europe in the summer of 1939, the Women's Land Army was reconstituted. It was originally formed during World War One, and women were used to fill the gaps created by men going to active service. The labour gaps were particularly felt in agriculture, as so many of the farm workers joined their lord's territorial unit, grateful for a few extra shillings a week that this brought in. So the area around here was extensively farmed by land girls. The Lady Denman, who was the head of the project, said, "The land army fights in the fields. It's in the fields of Britain the most critical battle of the present war may well be fought and won." So the Women's Land Army employed over 200,000 women between 1939 and 1950. And these women came from all walks of life. Land girls were critical to increasing the country's food production. Despite having little or no agricultural experience, they ploughed, grew produce, milked cows, caught rats, drove tractors, and pretty much everything else in between. They enrolled at their local Land Army headquarters or registered at the post office. They had to be 17 years old in order to join, but some women were much younger actually when they joined. And what they were looking for was physically fit, young unmarried women who had no dependents, who were mature enough to leave home and be sent anywhere in the country. So training varied among land girls. Some had 4 or 6 weeks training, some had none at all. If a woman received training, this could take place at agricultural college or at a training farm before being sort of posted to a farm. And training was given on the day-to-day routines of planting potatoes, milking on rubber udders, learning how to work with the animals, especially horses. And the tiring hard work was a shock to the system for many. Some women were sick every day. For good or bad, training broke women into a tough lifestyle of working in the Women's Land Army. And even after training, many girls started to return home because there was insufficient requests from a local farmer, especially at the beginnings of the war. There was still a reluctance for farmers to employ women in agricultural work. And the farm work placed upon the shoulders of women was strenuous. Nothing that had they hadn't done anything like this before. So from threshing to milking cows, the work was tiring and incredibly demanding. And there was 2 types of accommodation they lived in. Typically, there were the private billets, which were kind of farmhouses, farm workers' cottages, often alone or with 1 or 2 other land girls. But there's also hostels where the girls often worked and lived together. And this type of accommodation is typically represented in most television and film productions. You might see in TV land girls. That kind of puts them in a hostel. And these are often requisitioned country houses or specially erected hutments. So we're coming to the village of Westow now. And Westow is interesting because this was a major centre for the land girls. Lots of them lived in the village. Probably because a lot of the men, had moved off because they were territorial units to go off and fight. So territorial, by the way, for those not familiar, that's a part-time soldier. And a feature of country living is that many lords of the manor would have their own yeomanry, their own kind of basically sort of small part-time office, cadet forces, you might say, of local men. And these were called upon in the early days of the Second World War as the expeditionary force, along with the professional regular soldiers. Territorial units were called up, so there's a big pull of agricultural workers from the countryside to go over to France and Belgium. So consequently, that's why some of these villages were kind of depopulated. But isn't it gorgeous? So here in the village of Westow, the land girls were in private villages in the lovely cottages of the village. And this peacetime village must have felt very kind of different at this time, because not only were land girls resident here, many evacuees from Hull, which had been really heavily bombed during the Second World War, were also housed in Westow. So isn't it just gorgeous? With a beautiful kind of stone cottages. So again, really nice weather. So all this was filmed this morning. So fortunate with the weather. It was lovely and dry and warm. And what's that? As I say, because they're training peace, not time rush of war. Interesting. So all lovely stone cottages, beautiful villages. It's a must sort of visit place. So as I say, they're very proud of their kind of land girls' heritage here. And on top of this as well, you've got all the military personnel building up in the area. Now, just to kind of primer, obviously, would got out of Dunkirk. Obviously, the soldiers. And a lot have come back here. Some of them went off to the Far East, the kind of the Burma campaign. But others went to East Africa at first, deal with kind of Mussolini and Abyssinia, and then Monty's Eighth Army and so forth, and eventually ended up sort of in the attacks on sort of Sicily, Italy, and Monte Cassino and Anzio landing. Others began, particularly once the Americans joined the battle, to start to congregate in England. Eventually, mostly in southern England, but early on, literally all over the place, wherever they could put them for billets. So increasingly, within the communities, it wouldn't have been unusual to see military personnel throughout 1942, 43 and 44 building up and up and up, lots of military vehicles. Many of them lost, of course, because one of the most famous things that they did was to take back, to take away the road signs and the street signs and the directions, because they figured if there was going to be a German invasion, why help them to find anything? So consequently, imagine you're an American soldier here, you're a Canadian soldier here, and you're told to report to so-and-so, but you can't find anything that's on your map, because everything is now kind of designed to confuse the enemy, as you might say. So, echo on sound. Oh, that's interesting. I wonder what's happened on the echo on sound. Yes, sound doubled. Interesting. I wonder what happened there. Okay, I don't know why that should be. Is that still happening? Let me just try it. And monitors off. Let me know if that's helped Storm. Does that improve things? Echoes on. Fantastic. Good. So you've got this increasing numbers. So of course around these villages, you're going to see more and more military vehicles whizzing around. It's becoming the norm. To see service personnel, US personnel, Canadian service personnel, in these villages. It's all building up. Everybody knows that at some point there's going to be this big attack. We've been driven out of mainland Europe. We're working our way back in through North Africa, Mediterranean, of course the invasion of Sicily in 43, Italian landings. So we're trying to, work our way back in. But at some point, everybody knows there's going to be the big push. There's going to be going across the channels, and of course the Germans are that too. So you've got all these personnel, but it makes you wonder if anybody in this village would have been aware of the kind of top secret work that was happening just a mile down the road. So the D-Day Normandy invasion of June 1944 was only possible after years of preparation and stockpiling men and vehicles and material in England. In the months leading up to D-Day, many moved to the southern part of England, and that started like a massive army camp. But there were many service personnel in and around Westoe. Just to give you an idea, so here's obviously the First World War memorial. It's unusual insofar as that normally it's First and Second War names on there, but I could only see First War, which is kind of interesting. I always stop and look at the war memorials, as you know. So quite typical, traditional. So I say that street sign that you're looking at there almost certainly would have been taken out during the war, or anything that was there at its time. You certainly wouldn't go to help anybody. So you've got this kind of more and more personnel. To give you a kind of idea how many people were involved, about 6 million people, one way or another, were involved in the invasion from the Allied side. Largest numbers American and British, but many others, troops from all over the British Empire and the English-speaking world. You've got Czechs, French, Hungarians, and Poles hoping to free their countries, Jews who'd fled from Austria and Germany. It's kind of a remarkable alliance. Altogether, there were 39 divisions of soldiers in England immediately before the D-Day landings. And of these, 20 were from the USA, 14 were British, 3 were Canadian, 1 was French, and 1 was Polish. So as we remember and commemorate the D-Day invasion of the 6th of June 1944, it's important to understand this event did not just occur as a coincidence of efforts. The movement of more than 156,000 Allied troops ashore, with accompanying flotilla of almost 7,000 vessels and an area umbrella of over 11,000 aircraft of various types, required careful and detailed planning. An old-fashioned telephone box. You don't get many of those these days. I was intrigued because often the libraries now or defibrillators, but it actually was a phone. I can't remember the last time I actually saw a phone box. Was actually got a phone in it. I thought they'd all kind of finished. I was expecting to find some other purpose for it, but there you go. It's a phone box with a phone in. Who knew such thing even existed? So you've got all these personnel, you've got all this complexity. It all requires kind of careful and detailed planning, And in addition, of course, the plan has to be flexible and resilient enough to respond to enemy action and the associated fog and friction of war. Look what Alison was talking about a moment ago there. It's a bit like the Mike Tyson. It's easy to have a plan until you get punched in the face. And of course, the best laid plans can come under severe duress when it actually becomes, a real kind of moment of kind of conflict. We're so lucky on the weather today. So as I say, just for those who have joined late, this was all filmed this morning. So this was filmed on the 1st of June. So today, on the 80th anniversary. And it's my little telling, obviously, the events leading up to D-Day, but also why this area played a key role in making it a success, which we're going to get off on. Yeah, it's very tempting to go into the pub, I must say. Both this and the Stone Trough coming up both look very inviting. Of course, it was very warm, and luckily I didn't have to talk, so it's another real village hall there. I wasn't having to kind of get a dry throat that way. I was just focusing on kind of walking, but altogether it was probably about 4 miles walk backwards and forwards to film this. But anyway, back to the matter in hand. So you've got kind of extensive coordination going on between the Allied nations, the various services, and kind of countless supporting institutions. And it's called Operation Overlord. So a lovely sign for the cricket club. So while the overall plan evolved over the course of time, the base of amphibious assault rests on a set of components that establish a framework for the cross-channel assault. And these components and the associated framework evolved in the interwar period years before American involvement in World War II. And this is what the secret. I'm going to give you little hints of what we're talking about now. It's to do with amphibious landings that happened down here, and this is why we came here to tell this story. We're just walking now from Westow to Kirkham. So, in the years between the First War and the Second War, the Americans, particularly the American Navy, were increasingly convinced that there was going to be a conflict with Japan. Their imperialistic kind of expansion was seen to be, heading towards war with Japan, which of course, in the end, happened, didn't it? After Pearl Harbor, America and Japan were at war, but they realised that given Japan and all the islands and so forth in the Pacific, that amphibious warfare was something that was going to have to play a key role. So how were they going to be able to land men, vehicles, armaments, etc. onto beaches? How do you physically do that? It's not easy. It is incredibly difficult. For instance, the one of the things that we had to do is an awful lot of kind of subvertive work going on before the D-Day itself. But guys in canoes landing on various beaches in Normandy and taking sand to feel how dense it was, was it going to be solid enough that a tank wouldn't sink? So, did you know they had a competition actually, or again, subterfuge, of asking people to send in photos and postcards of their holidays they've been to in northern France, because what they wanted, because they couldn't get hold of any reconnaissance at that time because it was all held by the Germans, they wanted pictures of beaches in Normandy. So in 1942, they ran a national sort of competition, say, let's find the best pictures. And it was all about gathering kind of information. And interestingly, there was all sorts of really clever things they were doing, because obviously there was the French resistance. They were obviously involved, and at times would get involved in sort of destroying railways and blowing things up. But the reprisals against the French resistance were so tough that it was counterproductive. You didn't really want 100 villagers shot for blowing up a kind of a bar where a Nazi officer was. So they tended to go through more sort of quite devious things. So, for instance, they recruited in the intelligence a lot of women, particularly worked either in laundries, whereby they could describe the uniforms that were coming in. So by obviously the insignia on uniforms, you get a really clear idea of how high a command is. They also use women in brothels, because obviously the officers were kind of known to frequent these places, to get the guys drunk and then kind of go through the pockets, read through stuff, but also again report on what's the insignia, on the jackets, on the collars, on the epaulets and so forth, so that they had an idea what sort of where the German divisions were and where the high commands were and where you like to find panzer divisions, etc. So anyway, that's what they're going to be using. But amongst all, the Americans obviously planning amphibious assaults. So it's a really difficult operation to execute. So the movement of men and material is a coordinated effort from either ship to shore or shore to shore. Historically involves landing on a beach or an area where the enemy forces were absent, followed by subsequent movement inland. So they tried this in the First World War, of course, in the Dardanelles, to try and knock out the Ottoman Empire. You've probably heard of it. It's called Gallipoli, and it was seen as pretty much a disaster. And the advent of kind of long-range weapons as long-range artillery, machine guns, aircrafts, etc., meaning it was getting harder and harder. So most nations had kind of given up on the idea of amphibious assaults and placed it in the kind of too hard to do category. However, in the US, where there's a growing belief, as I say, of war with Japan was inevitable, there'd been a series of studies undertaken that resulted in a blueprint for Normandy. And the plan covered key areas needed to work in order for the plan to succeed. The clouds are beautiful, aren't they? I mean, they just looked absolutely stunning today. I keep sort of panning up for the clouds because they just look like almost unreally beautiful. They're so serene and beautiful. And so one of the key elements is about command relationships, of course, because when you're involving Navy, military, Marines, Navy, Air Force, who's in charge? And how do you keep these lines, kind of working when that fog of war kind of descends? Lines of authority can get quickly kind of confused in the heat of battle. So that's one of the things you really kind of need to work out. At what stage does the army take over after you've landed on the beach and so forth. So another really was this ship-to-shore movement, which is how assault forces embark upon a landing craft, how they traverse the expanse of the shore. Because obviously you come in on a to a larger boat, but then obviously you've got to have a shallow bottom vessel that can get you near to the beach, because obviously what you don't want is your guys have to run through a lot of water for a long time. So again, do you do it at high tide, which is great because then you can come in closer, but then you've got all the basically the mines and all the stuff that the Germans have put in the water. Do you do it at low tide? Well, that's great. Now you can see all the defences, but you've got a lot longer to go through the water and be a lot more exposed to the machine guns, the pillboxes. So all these things, things that need to be kind of balanced off and kind of planned very, very carefully. And obviously, as you know, on some beaches, it worked well. On others, Omaha Beach in particular, it didn't work at all well. So these were the kind of the things that they were trying to work through. You've also got kind of tidal variations and shore hydrography. So you need vehicles that can operate in surf zones. And because they're very shallow and they can sort of sit and deal with that, it means there's a lot of lateral movement of the crafts, which means that everybody gets horribly seasick. It's a really nasty. So, you've got to be able to, have boats, that can move in a kind of crowded area, potentially under enemy fire. So you need coxswains, the pilots, that handle their crafts in these unfamiliar and dangerous environments. So coming to Howardian Hills, so Howardian as in Castle Howard. So that's the area where we are. So an assault success is largely dependent upon building combat power ashore quickly. And this requires an organised and kind of tiny movement on the objective beach with a follow-on or on-call waves landing as quickly as possible. So basically, you want all to land at kind of the same time, get them ashore, go back, exit the surface zone, transit back to the offshore fleet, and then bring more back. So you're shuttling backwards and forwards. So this is a kind of really kind of key important. An Operation Overlord had been postponed and very nearly halted in its tracks due to a logistical bottleneck involving this kind of ship. And the culprit was a little appreciated and seldom admired type of naval craft known as the landing ship or tank or LST. And the shortage of these nearly upset the entire operation. And the LST, some irreverent sailors called it a large, slow target because they really were, they're very kind of vulnerable. They're not wrong. They're over 300 feet in length, these things. The maximum speed is 10 knots, so they're slow. And because they're amphibious, it makes them prime targets. They're remarkably hard to navigate with their blunt bows. It's like a snow shovel that can't cut through snow. This is what's said. They've got flat bottoms, so on every wave they just jar around. So even in relatively mild waters, you induce near universal seasickness amongst the soldiers and also the crew as well. And an LST veteran recalled the ship stank of diesel oil, backed up toilets, and vomit. So they could steam up onto a beach, open their bow doors, deploy a short ramp, and deposit wheeled or tracked vehicles directly into a sand. And operational commanders found them useful for other types of missions as well, from transporting personnel and vehicles providing floating stowage. The problem was there was simply not enough of them. And despite America's astonishing industrial productivity, circumstances conspired to create a shortage of these essential vessels at a critical moment in the war. Now, they really kind of ramped up production of these in 43 and 1943, but it was really kind of sheer luck because, in essence, the landing vehicles that were used had to be basically recycled from the Anzio landing. So everything in Italy had to work absolutely perfectly because they needed really basically to leave the troops on the mainland and then get out and get back across. So thankfully that went to plan. So the echo is back. I don't know why the echo is there. I'll just going to move back. Is it still on now? I wonder what's causing that. Let me just move that down a little bit. See if that helps. It's okay. I don't know what's causing that anyway. So the Allies needed a year to prepare for this complicated offensive, but they knew that the entire D-Day mission could be doomed to failure if the Nazis gained even 48 hours of advance notice on its location and timing. So they launched an elaborate disinformation campaign codenamed Operation Bodyguard. It may be a little bit of latency, a bit of streaming. Actually, could be a factor. So to cloak the details of the true invasion site, the Allies employed a complex web of deception to persuade the Nazis that an attack could come at any point along their Atlantic wall. The 1,500-mile system of coastal defences. Some of these vans came far too close to my liking. That the German High Commander constructed from the Arctic Circle to Spain's northern border. Or even as far away as the Balkans. So they really wanted to keep the Germans guessing. So vital to Operation Bodyguard's success were more than a dozen German spies in Britain who had been discovered, arrested, and then flipped by intelligence officers. So you're looking out across the Howardian Hills. It really is an absolutely beautiful area. So as I say, they were now double agents, these German spies. They'd been discovered in Britain and they were now working for the British services, and so basically were feeding the Germans duff information. So the Allies spoon-fed reams of faulty information to these Nazi double agents to pass along to Berlin. For instance, a pair of double agents named Mutt and Jeff relayed detailed reports about the fictitious British Fourth Army that was amassing in Scotland with plans to join with the Soviet Union in an invasion of Norway. And to further the illusion, the Allies fabricated radio chatter about cold weather issues such as ski bindings and the operation of tank engines in sub-zero temperatures. And the ruse worked as Hitler sent one of his fighting divisions to Scandinavia just weeks before D-Day. They did this before as well. I don't know if you're familiar with, you might have seen, there's a film recently about it, Operation Mincemeat, a fascinating deception, where prior to the invasion of Sicily, they completely wrong-footed the Germans. And what they did was that they got a corpse of a guy. I think he killed himself, actually. A tragic kind of situation. And they dressed him as an airman, and they put military orders and briefings in him and dumped him off Spain. Now, Spain was neutral, but it was very much kind of tied in with Nazi Germany. And so consequently, a fisherman found this body floating in the sea and brought it on ashore. They found the orders and they kind of completely bought into this false information, and it allowed the Allies to basically land on Sicily with far less kind of resistance. So there was a tradition, of using deception in warfare, was very, very kind of well established. So thankfully that pulled away, the fighting divisions. But obviously the most logical place in Europe for the D-Day invasion was the France's Pas-de-Calais region, 150 miles northeast of Normandy. So actually the bit where the channels that it's near is the bit where you swim the channel, where the Channel Tunnel is. That's the obvious point to go across. But the Allies had passed over this because it was a heavily fortified section of the Atlantic Wall. Obviously, the Nazis thought that's where the attack was going to come from, so consequently, that was absolutely solid in its defences, almost impregnable, really. So what they wanted was to persuade the Nazis that they were taking the shortest route across the channel. So all this subterfuge was all about ensuring that the Nazis believed the attack was going to come at Calais, Boulogne, on that part of the coast, rather than further down at Cotentin, near Cannes. That's spelled Cannes, C-A-E-N. Is that pronounce it? Can? Anyway. So to give the appearance of a massive troop build-up in southeast England, the Allies created a largely phantom fighting force. The 1st US Army Group, headed by George Patton, the American general whom the Nazis considered to be the enemy's best commander and the logical man to lead the cross-channel invasion. So the Allies broadcast endless hours of fictitious radio transmissions about troop and supply movements and planted wedding notices for fake soldiers in local newspapers. They deceived Nazi air reconnaissance planes by fashioning dummy aircraft and an armada of decoy landing crafts composed only of painted canvases pulled over steel frames around the mouth of the River Thames. And they even deployed inflatable Sherman tanks, which they moved to different locations under the cover of night using rollers to simulate tyre tracks left behind in their wake. It really was, a kind of, an incredible bit of it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so yeah, not Cannes. Alison's right. Cannes, as in on Côte d'Azur. Southwest, not that. So it's Cannes, Caen. So Normandy. So. So since the Allied codebreakers had been successful in deciphering German secret communications, this of course is Bexley Park. Is it Bexley? Bexley Park? Brexley? What's it called? One of you'll know. I can't think. Where the famous codebreakers were, Alan Turing and all that. It just escaped my Park. And one of you will say Bletchley, that's it. So of course the Enigma machine, you remember they catch off a U-boat, and those very clever people, they deciphered it. So their secret communications now, have been kind of breached. So they knew that the Nazis had fallen for the deception. That was the beauty of having broken the German, is it Bexley? I thought it was Bletchley. Bexley's in Kent. Bletchley, I thought so, Alison, yeah. Thank you, Bletchley. Terrible memory. So they've got, they know that the Nazis have swallowed it, basically. So in the weeks leading up to the invasion, the Allies stepped up their aerial attacks on Pas-de-Calais to throw the Nazis off the scent. They even employed Lieutenant M.E. Clifton King, a small-time Australian actor who bore a striking resemblance to Bernard Montgomery, or Monty as he was known, to impersonate the British general. And after James spent time with Monty to study his mannerisms, he donned one of the general's uniforms and black berets and flew to Gibraltar on May the 26th, 1944, and then to Algiers, where German intelligence was sure to spot him and surmised that no attack across the English Channel could be imminent, with the Allied generals scouting the Mediterranean. So isn't it, it's so clever, it's so devious, but they say that the truth is the first casualty of war. Now, I think all this you can accept, was done all for the greater good, but I think it's a kind of remarkable, what was done to basically give, our service personnel of the Allied forces the very, very best opportunity to make a success of their landing. So given the kind of sheer ambition of the operation, it's kind of not surprising that most of the attention of the planners was on the landing itself and not what would come after. By the way, just to ask, have any of you on here, have any of you got relatives that were involved in the landings? I should ask really, it's appropriate, isn't it? Have any of you got links to what was happening on any of the 5 beaches today, 80 years ago today? Do let me know. Very good. The Imitation Game, Alan Turing. It's an excellent film, isn't it? Excellent portrayal. So do let me know if you got any family links. I don't. I've got links to the First War, but not the Second War really, because my grandfather was Home Guard. He was a bit older, so he was Home Guard, Dad's Army, and all that in the Second War. He was also a reserved occupation. So no, my father's in D-Day +5. Oh, well, of course that's interesting, Alison, because obviously when we say D-Day. Those D-Day +1, 2, etc. They were counting the days, and the idea was that within 14 days they wanted to have captured Cherbourg, a deep water port. So that was what success looked like. The actual D-Day itself was, of course, the amphibious landings of Overlord, getting everybody onto the beaches, developing a beachhead, and on most beaches that worked pretty well. Omaha was the really, really challenging one, as we know, where Saving Private Ryan was filmed. So then, of course, the idea after that is you've got more and more troops, vehicles, tanks, personnel, munitions, supplies coming day after day after day. So consequently, it is, after D-Day 1+, and theoretically every day until the surrender of Berlin really was kind of D-Day plus a number. And so about really 15 months or so, thereabouts. Anyway, so when we look at this landscape here, it's actually not a million miles away from what they were going to encounter in Normandy. This is the Stone Trough pub, coming up by a lovely pub on the edge of Kirkham. So again, we'll just get a view across the Vale. About to reveal the secret of this village. So, Normandy was the scene of furious fights several weeks after June the 6th, 1944. And after the Battle of the Beaches, you get what the historians call hedge war. The hedge warfare, known as the bocage, began as early as the day of D-Day itself, and ended at the end of August 1944, when Allied troops ended up liberating most of the present-day Basse Normandy. But virtually 2 months of deadly and fierce fighting to put men to the test. And thankfully, the secret planning for this challenge started here, in this village, in early 1944. So the hedgerows of Normandy were an integral part of the agricultural landscape. They're still there, the bocage. If you drive around Normandy, they're enormous. Up to 5 meters in height, very many meters deep. There's also large rock formations across the landscape, making it even more tricky. And it was incredibly difficult fighting conditions because, of course, the Germans had been there for 4 years. They dug themselves in. They had all the best sightlines. All the best sightlines. And of course, the thing with the bocage is it's very difficult to attack because you've got to break cover and be out in the open, whereas to defend, you don't. So they dug themselves in. They had hidden tanks, heavy machine guns, you name it, kind of 40-pounders, 90-pounders, big guns that could be just sort of buried in these hedgerows and virtually unseen. Until they go across them. So consequently, incredibly dangerous hand-to-hand fighting. It's lovely to see the horses in the field. So the Germans had a huge advantage in the bocage. They'd also flooded much of the land around their positions, meaning that any attack had to involve amphibious vehicles. So the hedge warfare began on the early hours of June the 6th, 1944. So on D-Day itself, the hedge started, because along with the beach landings, you also got aerial lines. If you remember, we were up at Sutton Bank not so long back. Do you remember me telling you about the gliders training for D-Day? Because an awful lot of the landing, particularly the 101, I think, American Air Force Command, they came in on gliders and parachutes. There was an enormous amount of paratroopers and people coming in on gliders that landed, obviously, into fields and so forth, the villages. And they're immediately confronted with this vegetation. So coming to Kirkham Village now. So Allied gliders were loaded with men and equipment, ammunition, small vehicles, heavy weapons. They hit the hedges in the same way that a car launched at full speed hits a wall. It really was bam, and they trained for it here. So, in a minute, as you go down, you're about to spot something that you may or may not be aware is here. And that is a monastery. There's an 800-year-old ruined monastery in this village. So Pegasus Bridge, absolutely. So I'd say that the Allied landings, and of course they repeated that with Operation Market Garden, didn't they? And a little bit further on, up the coast, was that Holland? Belgium? I forget anyway, but there was a lot of that kind of going on, wasn't there, using gliders and so forth. So... but the key thing was it was going to be very dense hedges, a lot of it waterlogged. It was going to be in and out of rivers. So that's what we needed to train for. So an 800-year-old monastery might seem an odd place for pre-invasion planning, but it had the benefit of being located on the banks of the River Derwent. So this isolated Yorkshire village was perfect. So we're coming down into the village. I mean, it's hardly any village at all. I mean, I can't sort of impress on you how small this place is, that to have had this kind of key role ahead of Operation Overlord is just bizarre. But there we are. Nonetheless, it's absolutely true. And all this has come out sort of fairly recently. I'd imagine sort of 70-year rule, maybe. I don't know how long it took to kind of release the papers. But this isn't something that's been known about for a long time. It's only kind of comparatively recently. And English Heritage have played a kind of key role in researching exactly what went on here. And of course, English Heritage are the protectors, the conservators of the ruins of the abbey. So Kirkham Priory on the banks of the River Derwent, Cistercian, I believe, monastery, sort of typical of all the monastic stories that I've told you. Insofar as they need obviously source of water, isolated communities and so forth. So it was a great location for the monks. But who knew that 800 years later, these men of peace would provide a fantastic environment and training ground for the men of war. But perhaps you could be generous and say that they were, of course, trying to aim for peace. And it is absolutely beautiful. I mean, the really lovely big house just up here. But at this stretch of water that you're going to see in a minute, large numbers of the Allied forces trained. I'm just going to take a sip. I'm just a bit thirsty. I'm a bit dry in my throat from talking. I'll just quickly read through your comments if there's anything that I've missed. Oh dear, Michelle, shot by a sniper, of course. Glider's very scary. Has anyone been in a glider? I did it once. No, twice actually. And the first time was like I had a cabin over it, which was lovely. But the first time was open top. I couldn't believe how noisy it was. I think the wind noise in these videos is bad. God, the glider. It is absolutely remarkable. Yes, Patrick, yes, he did. Took you. So of course, just a reminder, there was 5 beach landings on D-Day, wasn't there? Sword, Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, did I say? I think that's the 5. But it was for what immediately came after that the training happened here. So at this stretch of water, large number of Allied troops practiced water crossings and vehicle landings, believe it or not. I'm starting to think the Echo is an internet-related thing that comes and goes. So hopefully it will pass again quickly. I'll turn the audio input down a little bit again, but I don't think it'll make much difference. I think it's a latency issue. So when we get down to the water, so obviously you're seeing images of the monastery there. There's not huge amounts of it there. Compared to some of the monasteries of Yorkshire, it's a relatively kind of modest room, which is kind of interesting. Maybe it's because it was kind of seen as expendable. That they thought, oh, we can use that actually to we can risk damage, as you might say. So I'm just waiting for it to kind of catch on, sort of slightly ahead of my kind of script. That's good, it's gone again. So you can see it's set in the Holdings. So of course, imagine how private this was. You've seen me do this walk now, of kind of mile or so down, in the 1940s. This would have been incredibly cut off, a wonderful kind of secret location. We don't know, of course, whether the people in Westoe were aware of what was going on down here. We don't know what the access would have been into the village, whether there would have been military personnel guarding and preventing unauthorised access. I think there's every chance that was the case, because they wanted, what was happening here to be under the radar. So I would imagine, although I don't know, I have no knowledge of this specifically, but I'd imagine this would have been a controlled area in 1944. So as we come in to the village, you're going to see that you see a train going through. Just there's a little level crossing. If you see that through the middle of the picture. So just no, there's more than one house. There's about 2 or 3. You're going to see as we kind of get to the bottom. But really, they would have been properties, originally on this site that served the monastery. For lay brothers, I would think, lay accommodation. There isn't a village as such. The village is at Westoe, and on the other side there's another village, Whitwell on the Hill, which is about a mile's frame, I think it's called. So it's a hamlet. You describe it really. It's not really a village. I mean, it's very, very beautiful, but it's not really a village as such. There's no infrastructure here. There's no high street. There's nothing here. It's simply a location on a map. Which is, perhaps that's exactly what the military wanted, was where there was just a location on a map, rather than people wouldn't mind their own business. I think you're absolutely right. I think they would obviously know that the military needed, of course, secure areas whereby they could plan and prepare. So as you can see, we're coming up now towards the gatehouse, so one of the better sort of preserved sort of parts of the monastery, and this, of course, is where the service personnel would have come in. And they actually used this to practice climbing, believe it or not. Not many cars. They wouldn't have had cars. No, absolutely gentle. It's a very out-of-the-way place. So the high elevations were used to kind of mimic the rock faces in Normandy. They'd throw up scramble nets to to show the guys, how to climb, how to kind of get over. So scramble nets like a knotted kind of rope nets and so forth. So they used this landscape as an activity training centre. So this was, for foot soldiers, infantry guys, as you might say, or those, as part of kind of obviously amphibious crews, because the whole thing was going to be like, like the carrying the Alice will know about this. Do it in the Royal Tournament, the carrying of the guns, right? You may have seen it, but the Royal Tournament in Earl's Court, they do it in a traditional army and navy thing, and it's like a Napoleonic gun type thing, isn't it? And they have to take it apart, but you run like an assault course and kind of put it back together and kind of fire it at the end, which is a great competition between the services, but is a real reflection of the reality of being in the field and moving armaments along. You've got to know how to strip down guns and heavy armaments and break them into bits you can all carry, move across, get them across rivers, across water, whatever it might be. So that was, kind of very much the kind of the vibe here, was about how are you going to deal with these places which are very rural, have got these huge, dense, very high hedges, lots of rock formations, lots and lots of water. What are you going to do? How are you going to kind of manage this environment? So that's what this training. So this training camp that was here, literally as you're looking at it right now, on this site and in the river next to it, which we're going to talk about in just a second. And what's fantastic, of course, is we get fantastic views of the local cattle, and it's always such a lovely. I mean, what glorious day it was today. 80 years anniversary, and so beautiful. So I thought I'd bring you over to show the livestock. It's an absolutely beautiful spot, isn't it? It's so bucolic that I think associating it with war seems kind of off kilter, really. But nonetheless, this was, a key sort of training centre. So you can start seeing how the River Derwent coming into view. Along the way there. So, you're the sip, my throat's sticky. So you see the bridge coming into view over the Derwent. And at this stretch of water, you've got large numbers of Allied troops practicing water crossings and vehicle landings. So he's emulating the kind of landscape they're going to find in France, where they've got to get people, kit, vehicles, munitions, supplies, etc. across wetlands, across wet areas. So that whole focus is on trying to create preparedness. But also, you've got to put your vehicles to the test. Now, bear in mind, of course, in this period of time, the Americans were producing most of these vehicles. Okay, so the Americans did a lot of business with the Second War, insofar as the huge numbers of trucks and so forth were rolling off the production line in America, and many of these were these amphibious vehicles or vehicles intended to be waterproof. But actually, until you have a go, you find actually how the sealants work. Do the gaskets work? Is it actually waterproof, or is it going to cause problems and go clunk? On the first, kind of time of use. That's amazing, Dan. So Daniel's adopted father was an engineer and minesweeper clearing paths to the DDR. Well, I mean, there was millions of mines, wasn't there, being placed all along the coast because obviously the Germans have been there for so long, that time to just make it, so many obstacles and mines, so absolutely atrocious. So this water, as I say, was used to test the vehicles for the waterproofing. They used basically splash testing, running them through, but also tasking the teams with getting these vehicles and supplies across deep, fast-flowing rivers. So the Derwent's a fast-flowing river, so that's the whole thing. You've got to be able to deal with. It's no good to have a nice little, stagnant pond. You've got to be able to do this, when the current is moving. So consequently, the Derwent was perfect. It's secluded, but it's got all the attributes. You look at it, and it could easily be, in the banks of a French chateau, couldn't it? So it's not at all surprising I suppose, that they looked at this and felt that it was a perfect landscape. And of course, a long way away from the south, which is where all the main build-up was, by this stage, most of the service personnel were down in the south. There wasn't much going on in the north because, again, there was fewer eyes on this. You know, the south is by now the big camp waiting for the big push. So this is a long, long way away from peering eyes. But all these trucks that are coming off, and landing, in this country, they're being checked, they're being tested. Tanks, jeeps, other forms of equipment are being tested. Are they watertight? Are they going to work? Have we found ways of making this kind of work? Can we get across these fast-moving rivers? Are we going to get stuck when we get to, to France? How is it actually going to work? These are the kind of the key things. So, sorry, that's what this centre was all about. So, isn't it beautiful though? I mean, there's something I think just incredibly serene is the word that I'm going to say. That it can't have been at all like that in the spring and early summer of 1944. It must have been very noisy and very active, but you don't get any sense of that today. It is quite the opposite. It is absolutely, I say serene. It's the old station house, so the train line kind of goes in behind there. It is so peaceful. So now I'm going to take you on a walk down to the waterside, so you can actually get a sense of the place, because I think it does help to get down by the water. And on the other side, you can't do it; it's kind of private land. So I was thinking you get down where the cows are, you can't get in. So I'm going to walk down for the kind of final part of this, and kind of walk you along the riverside, so you can just get a kind of real sense of the place, kind of where they were, where this activity was happening. With this large number of waterproof vehicles being tested, and these teams running over and over and over again these same kind of exercises. It does look like a packhorse bridge, doesn't it? Yeah, I think it's interesting that you kind of mentioned that. So packhorse bridges, of course, were designed pre-car. So they tend to be quite narrower than that is, but it's certainly got the attributes that looks like a packhorse bridge. But I don't think normal packhorse bridges are very low as well, which is what that one is. And the reason being is that if you had bales either side of your animal, they wouldn't get trapped in the walls. They could sort of sit, if you like, either side. It only needed wide enough for a couple of donkeys to get through, and that would then, in effect, allow you to carry your big bales either side of your horse or donkey or whatever else that you're using, your mule. So I don't think it is a packhorse bridge, but it's certainly got some similarities in that. So we're coming down then to the River Derwent, and this is the area, and it's surprisingly kind of marshy and boggy down here. I was sort of amazed. I sort of stepped off the path, and immediately I was into squelch, and my trainers, I was wishing I'd worn boots. So very, very kind of wet, sort of marshy land. So again, very relevant of the landscapes that they were going to be encountering in Normandy. So the river here, this was the location, like I say, for tanks, for jeeps, for landing crafts, for training the teams that are going to be involved in the bocage, in the hedge warfare, in the days following D-Day, to basically just get in and amongst it. And isn't it beautiful? I mean, the bridge itself, I think, I say it's not a packhorse bridge, but it's just beautiful. I mean, I think the entire environment. I mean, I would have loved to have done this live, of course, but simply the reality is that there just wasn't the juice for me to be able to do that. Right. Okay. Sorry about that. So let me just move my audio now. One sec. Default. Okay, so hopefully you're able to hear me. Yeah, I had to unplug my microphone then because my battery on my laptop was running out, so I had to basically pull that across. So winning the Newfoundland in the war, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think landscape would have been very, very similar to how it is now, Leslie. Um, of course, as I say, this was farmed by the land girls all around here, so we know this was an agricultural landscape. Absolutely, that's kind of what it was. So yeah, and obviously you can sort of see the cattle on the other side of the bank. It's a really good zoom that I've got on this new phone, so I'm really pleased with it. So this is all filmed on my new phone, the one that I left behind the what do you call it, the SIM card when I kind of went out. No, I didn't fall in the river. No, I am back with you, so hopefully you can hear and see me. And yeah, hi, Lethargy. So what a spot. And who'd have thought it would? So when I heard that that this site had this really interesting and hitherto kind of unknown sort of connection to D-Day, that was about preparedness, that was about helping the Allied service personnel to practice in environments that were going to really help them when they got across to Normandy. It just felt like a brilliant story to be able to tell on the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And of course, I was hoping that Patrick might have done something for France, but I guess he wasn't available. So obviously, I wasn't here, couldn't do this from France, but it felt to me that this was a good story and a nice place to show you about. So let's ask who found out about it. I mean, English Heritage are the first ones that start talking about it publicly. So whether they found something in the records, or maybe there was a release. They've sort of 30 year, 50 years, it's 75-year releases on information. So it's quite possible that something was released in recent times that kind of pointed to all this. It certainly wasn't sort of part of the living memory and the knowledge of the local community. It's certainly very, very recent that all this has kind of come to light. So I don't know is the answer to that. But I think it's fascinating that, as I say, this little sleepy corner of North Yorkshire, 15 miles or so from York, plays such a key role. And at the end of the day, in those 2 months of fighting in the bocage, they were successful. It was a long drag, but it would seem that the training that they did here, that had been drilled into them, of getting in and out of water, obviously gave them a preparedness that enabled them. So we've got a weir on this side, and again, I've no idea what this weir is for, or indeed if it was there in 1944. So to us, the name of the village, it's not really a village really, it's called Kirkham, Kirkham Priory. It's a hamlet really rather than a village. There's very, very little there other than the ruins of this 800-year-old monastery. The shores of obviously the River Derwent, beautiful bridge and so forth, and a very, very small level crossing, so a place where obviously trains sort of come across. And so it's such a non-location, other than it being very beautiful and a walker's place. But that's perhaps why it was so perfect for what they wanted. It just represented a landscape that they were going to encounter overseas, and there was space as well, because southern England was so full. I'm sure there have been rivers in southern England that could have done this in, but it was so full of divisions, of 39 divisions of the army, etc. There probably wasn't the space. There wasn't the space to do it in secret. So I guess that's why this was interesting. And I'll give you a sense of how important it was. In March 1944, Princess Elizabeth came with King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Oh, she wasn't the Queen Mother then, but she came with the Queen Mother. Interesting, Alison. A Church of England church needs a hamlet and a pub. A church and a pub. Well, I don't think there's a church there. The church is at Westow, so and at Whitwell, so it's probably not a hamlet. It's just a spot then. Okay, interesting. But in March 1944, Princess Elizabeth came with the King and the Queen, and this was their first official visit. So isn't that interesting? That I think of all the public visits that Queen Elizabeth would to go on and do, either first as Princess Elizabeth, and then obviously Queen Elizabeth, 70 years on the throne, this was the very first one that she did. The first official visit she did was here to see this training system. And 3 days later, Winston Churchill came. So Churchill came down with a bunch of American generals to look at preparation, see how things were going, and it obviously went brilliantly. But it would seem that the difference was with the monastery there, they really did have God on their side. Um, and of course, many lives were lost in the landing at the beaches, but equally, many more made it through. And of course, it was the beginning of the end of the Second World War. And for that, of course, we give enormous thanks and gratitude to everybody who served in whichever way 80 years ago, and to anybody that had family members involved, our heartfelt greetings. So there we go. Hopefully, that was an interesting primer for you, a story that you might not be at least familiar with, and which is always interesting. I think if you were able to see, have I actually frozen now? I'm just trying to bring myself back. I think it's always nice to hear a story you haven't heard before. I've gone. Where have I got? Let's just try and get them back. Oh, there we go. So, I thought it was interesting, and we do, of course, hats off respect to all veterans, of course, Alison, retired service personnel, so deep respect to everybody who served in any way whatsoever. And of course, the lovely, not lovely thing, but for our community, we're talking about US service personnel, we're talking about Canadian personnel, we're talking about British, and we're talking about people from all over the empire were involved in this in this kind of campaign, this operation. So it really is, I think, a day that brings us all together. I'm sure some of you will have seen kind of pictures both today and yesterday. And of course, we must reflect on the fact that so few living witnesses are still with us now. Until recently, it was the First World War where veterans were dying off, and now, of course, the Second War is just the same, isn't it? So, consequently, the fantastic thing is we've got this testimony. We've got a wonderful kind of store of history and first-hand testimony and so forth that made writing this tour a lot easier to kind of pull upon. So thank you everybody for joining me. I do really enjoy doing stuff at home. I know it's not, some people think, oh, at home's not so great, but I think that worked. And as I say, with my new camera, I think it was very good. That was shot in 4K, so hopefully it came across sort of as nice high quality. And there are lots of villages in Yorkshire that simply aren't anywhere close to 4G. So if you guys are happy and want to support, I'll maybe do one of those a month, just so I can bring you places that I would love to show you, but right now are just so off limits with 4G. But if that, the way we did it today, won't be about D-Day, obviously, be other things. But if that format kind of works, then I'm very, very happy to do some more. So on that basis, I'm going to say thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and it's been an absolute